Welcome everyone. We're getting down to the last few lectures of the term, and today the topic's going to be public opinion. And so public opinion is, again, one of these things that's come up numerous times throughout the term. So far, we're going to get into a lot more detail about it in today's lecture. So what is public opinion? Broadly speaking, it's just the set of beliefs that are held in the public or among individuals that matter to government. So what are the types of things that fall under this domain? Things like, we just got done with a long presidential election cycle. This is a chart showing public opinion aggregated regarding that race. Support for Trump in the red series, support for Clinton in the blue series. This is taken from Real Clear Politics, which is an aggregation site where they take a bunch of different public opinion surveys, which is the most frequent way of gauging public opinion, just asking people through big surveys throughout the country what they think on whatever issues you're interested in. So here we have national support for Trump and Clinton. Oftentimes we're interested in public opinion within a specific group, so there will be more targeted opinion polls toward these people. So for instance here, this is the data from Florida. So this is of course a really big swing state in the election, so we were particularly interested in how states like these would turn out, so there's a lot of polling specifically among people in Florida. Again, Trump in red, Clinton in blue. Beyond elections, though, oftentimes we're just going to be interested in how things are going in government. What do people think of what their officials in Washington are doing? So here we've got approval for President Obama and how he's doing with his job. Here, red would be people who respond to these surveys that say they disapprove of the way he's doing. Black being those who approve, and as it stands now, you've seen he's enjoyed a recent trend of pretty positive approval. At other points in time, it's varied between positive and negative throughout his term. Here's a similar graph, but this time this is an aggregation of congressional approval. So, I mean, you see here that approval of Congress is, on the whole, a lot more negative than it tends to be for the president. This isn't just in recent times either. This happens to be a pretty reliable trend, going back pretty far, that Congress tends not to be liked as the performance overall in the public. Maybe some of you have heard the trope that people tend to like their congressman or congresswoman, but not necessarily the overall job that Congress is doing. So that's reflected here in that. See, at the moment, you've been at over 70% disapproval for a while. You can ask broad questions about the overall job that government is doing and the state of the country. So here, what is the direction of the country? Are we on the right track or the wrong track? And this is another instance where you can go back a while, and at least in recent years, more people have said we're on the wrong track than the right track. Oftentimes, when there's a particularly important policy debate going on, survey firms will want to ask about this, because this is obviously, for instance, healthcare here. Going back to 2009, when the debate was going on, 2010, when the Affordable Care Act is eventually passed, and continuing up to the present period, when we're sort of in the implementation and evaluation phase. This is really maybe the hallmark legislation of the Obama term, and it has really wide-ranging ramifications for the country and the healthcare system. So this is a topic, when you have issues like this, that survey firms will often ask about. Do you like this law? Do you dislike it? And I guess the overall trend here is that the Affordable Care Act hasn't been particularly popular. It hasn't been overwhelmingly rejected, so a substantial amount of people here who do like it. Obviously the split here is going to be heavily partisan, to where Republicans and will tend to disfavor it, and Democrats will tend more to favor it. But overall, the trend has been somewhat negative toward this law going forward. And again, in terms of public opinion, this is going to be interesting going forward. We discussed in the lecture on domestic policy that this is going to be a big debate and big fight in Washington in the coming months, as far as what happens with the Affordable Care Act now that we have a Republican president coming in. So this is going to be an area of public opinion that's probably going to receive heavy polling going forward. First of all, support for repealing Obamacare potentially, and then support for whatever alternative policies put forth in Congress if there is one. And the lecture today is going to proceed as follows. So first of all, it's worth noting that you look at these different types of public opinion questions we've asked so far. Most of them are presented in a dichotomous manner, right? Here you're either for or against Obamacare, right direction, wrong direction, approve, disapprove. So a lot of dichotomies presented so far. The first section, we're going to deconstruct public opinion into a few additional components that are also important, beyond just the dichotomy of whether you're for or against something. Next, we're going to get into arguably the most important question as far as public opinion goes, pertaining to political knowledge. And to preview, this is just going to be a discussion of, given that we have a democratic society, people have influence over the direction of government. One would expect that in order for the country to function correctly, some minimal level of political knowledge is needed to inform public opinion, right? So if people don't know anything about politics, we wouldn't expect democracy to be that great of a system. What we'll, to spoil it a little bit, what we'll see in this section is things aren't entirely encouraging regarding the state of political knowledge in the country. And so the next section will be dealing with, given that there is a fairly high degree of ignorance of certain things about politics in the country, how does our political system nonetheless seemingly function well most of the time throughout history? And the final section here is going to be dedicated to discussing how do individuals form political attitudes. So given the information that someone encounters in the world about politics, how do they take that and integrate it into an opinion about Obama or healthcare or the direction of the economy or whatever we're talking about? We'll be actually drawing on some psychological theories in a bit of detail to tell us how does this happen? How do people form their own political attitudes? Okay, so to begin, let's get into a little bit more depth about what the various components of public opinion are. We've talked so far about public opinion in terms of whether the country is for or against a policy, support or oppose a particular political figure, and these sort of bidirectional valence judgments, they can be referred to as the direction of opinion. So typically we can conceive of most questions that we might be interested in on politics, subjective ones that is, as going in one direction or the other. You support the president or you oppose the president. You want a particular bill to go into law or you don't. So this is oftentimes the direction of things, maybe the most important component of public opinion, and this is what's going to be most often reported. When we're talking about the media reporting their polls, usually they're maybe most interested in just how many people are in favor of repealing Obamacare versus how many people are opposed to repealing Obamacare. Some additional components to opinion that sometimes aren't as widely reported but can nonetheless be important are, first of all, intensity. And this is the measurement of how strongly a person thinks about their opinion on an issue. So direction, for example, being you're opposed to Obamacare, just to keep using that example. Intensity being how opposed are you? So you could have some people that are just mildly opposed, that have some ambiguity, ambivalence in their opinion, that they could go either way, and then there'll be people who are just really, really opposed to it. So there's can sometimes, depending on what issue you're talking about, be a high degree of variance as far as the intensity of opinion goes among the population. This can vary sometimes with the impact of a bill. So if there's a bill such as healthcare that's likely to have a really extensive and meaningful impact throughout the country, opinions on it can oftentimes be a lot more intense than more mundane things that just don't matter as much to directly to the people. So a lot of times people are less intensely focused on foreign affairs, for instance, just because a lot of the things that go on with the United States foreign policy don't have as much of a direct impact on the people as these really important domestic programs like healthcare. Personal stakes can also matter. Continue on the healthcare example, if you're somebody who directly benefits from the Affordable Care Act, for example, your direction would probably be, first of all, in support of it, and then given your personal stakes in the matter, you're probably likely to have a pretty strong opinion there. If you're someone who's just, you're in support of it, but you don't necessarily benefit directly from the program, you're not a part of one of the healthcare exchanges, you aren't one of these people that was previously uninsured and then gains coverage after Obamacare, you probably don't care as much about it as someone who is in that group of people that went from being uninsured to then gaining insurance. These people, on average, will probably feel a lot more intensely about their support for the bill. Another dimension of opinion is salience. So salience is somewhat related but distinct from intensity. This is the importance that people think is associated with a given opinion. So if you're talking about a particular policy, how important do you think it is? So you can have a variety, an array of opinions on things like taxation, immigration, healthcare, national security. We can keep going down the list. Each of these various issues within these domains is going to have a particular degree of salience to you. Some people think taxation is most important, some people think immigration is most important, some people think other issues are more important. And the relationship between salience and intensity is probably pretty intuitive. You would expect there to be a high degree of positive correspondence between these two factors. You don't imagine that someone's going to have, in most cases, a really salient issue that's really important to them that they just don't have any intense feelings on, or vice versa. You don't imagine most people with really intense feelings on a particular issue lack salience, or it lacks salience to them. You wouldn't expect that to usually be the case. Again, really, the most prominent issues that are likely to have the most effect on the country, these will tend to be the ones that are most salient at a given time. Salience, of course, can vary on a temporal basis. The most important issues that are at the national forefront today may look different to what they are months or a year or more down the line. And again, there's also a degree of personal level variance here. So for people directly affected by a given issue, like women's issues, women as a group are probably more concerned, and these issues are more salient to them than they are for men. Taxation, another example. If you're someone who's paying a lot in taxes, or you're in a particular bracket that's going to be directly affected by a proposed taxation measure, the degree of salience of this issue is going to be a lot more personally relevant to you and increase the salience of it to you. Finally, stability. This is an interesting one. So stability is just referring to, how likely is it that your opinion on a given matter will change, and with what frequency does it change? And we might want to think of opinion as relatively stable. So if you're somebody who supports higher taxes for those that are rich, just to throw out an example, we would expect that person, if you ask them a question about taxation, they're going to answer in a similar manner if I ask it today, and then if I ask it a month down the line or a year down the line. Just the way we think about politics, I think we tend to believe people have relatively stable opinions. However, when you look at empirical patterns of people who have asked questions in surveys at multiple different points in time, what you'll see is that there is a high degree of instability when you look at individuals in the population. So if you ask someone their opinion on one matter, and then you ask them a month later the exact same question, there's a bit more change there than we might expect or might desire in the system. So stability in opinion is a bit more than we just might intuitively expect. And this ties into this next question that we're going to be talking about, political knowledge. So just to set up the discussion here, we exist in a democratic system. We have a republic in which the people are responsible for selecting members to serve in the Senate, the House of Representatives, and the president through the Electoral College, of course. And so, given this responsibility that the public has, there's some degree of expectation of informed opinions, right? So, normatively, we wouldn't want a bunch of people, the electorate, to be composed of everyone who has no idea what's going on with current affairs or the issues of the day, and they just go and vote for whoever based on something that doesn't really have any basis in sound reason or logic. This isn't to say that there's any sort of objectivity in the people we choose. Everyone's going to have the preferences that are derived from whatever reason, but we would want those preferences to have some backing in their own interests. For example, this is one area of knowledge we might want people to have. Know what your interests are, however you may define them, and then go out and identify the officials and vote for them that best reflect your interests. This is the basic level of knowledge we would want people to have in a well-functioning democracy. So let's now talk about whether this is actually the case. What can we say about the degree of knowledge seen in the electorate? If you look at, again, empirical patterns based on public opinion surveys, the picture is kind of bleak. Given most of the evidence, we would have to say that people have relatively low levels of knowledge. Probably the most extensive empirical exploration of this question, though it's a few decades old at this point, is this book, What Americans Know About Politics and Why It Matters. If this is a topic that interests you, you may want to track this one down in the library. So what the authors do here, Deli Carpini and Scott Keeter, they basically aggregate 50 years worth of survey questions, which adds up to over 2,000 in the book if you look at it, and basically try to see for each question what proportion of people get it right. So all these questions would be pertaining to objective political knowledge that we'll get into some examples on the next slide, but things like do you know who the Speaker of the House is, for example, things that have a specific answer that people know or they don't know, and so the authors here are interested in seeing what the proportion is of those who do know for each question. And when you break things down, very few of the questions you see a high degree, a really consensus level of knowledge, so only 13% do you see 3/4 or more of the population get correct. Maybe more disturbingly, only 41% of the questions do you even see a majority of people getting them correct. And so the types of questions you'll see in their analysis and other analyses that have that are similar, that have been conducted since, are questions like these. So like, were there more deaths in Iraq and Afghanistan in 2009? So this is just to deconstruct this question, this is a question where in 2009, the war in Afghanistan is kind of getting more intense than the war in Iraq, the Iraq war being the bigger conflict for a while. And so this question is just trying to see how attuned people are to the changing dynamics, in our foreign conflicts. And so only 43% answered this correctly. The correct answer would have been more deaths in Afghanistan. A lot of times you'll see questions and surveys that deal with particular people. So who's the president of Russia? Who is Nancy Pelosi? Other ones like easier ones like vice president, things like this. And you can look at the frequencies here, and there's definitely not a uniform level of knowledge. And some of these questions, there's a satisfactory level, and others not really. The point being, though, is that when you take these sort of questions and take the entire body of available evidence, such as what they do in this book, the overall picture isn't that encouraging. It's worth noting, though, before we proceed, that this paradigm that we're talking about right now, just looking at knowledge questions on surveys, hasn't always been, it's not uniformly met among political scientists as a good way to gauge knowledge and effective knowledge among the electorate. So you can think of a few reasons why it might not be. One, for technical reasons, some people have questioned the way these questions are asked and what they look like on the surveys. Other scholars have questioned whether or not it's actually necessary to know these type of items that we're talking about in order to fulfill your role in the democracy. So if you're a voter, you've got to know, generally, do I favor the Democratic candidate or the Republican candidate? This is your primary choice in most cases. Is it really necessary to know who is the president of Russia? Specific aspects of current events. Maybe people in the government aren't necessarily directly related to the choice. So there's another line of questioning here, as far as how closely related are the sort of questions that we ask about political knowledge on surveys related to the overall ability of people to make appropriate choices when they go to vote. Another topic that is related to but distinct from political knowledge is the extent to which people in the electorate are ideological in their political positions. So if you think back to the very first lecture, we were talking about how ideology is most typically depicted in two dimensions. You have the dimension concerning economic issues, and then the dimension containing social issues. And so if you're someone who's a really ideological person, if I know, just for an example, your position is strongly liberal on economic issues, I'll have a pretty good chance of predicting where the rest of your positions are on the economy. They're probably likely to be mostly liberal. So this is one way of thinking of ideology. It's just basically a structure and predictability to your sets of opinions across these different dimensions. And so a question is, if you might think that if people do have well-formed political attitudes, they should eventually crystallize into a coherent ideology for most people. You can think of some arguments why this might not be the case. So, for instance, you have some people who are genuinely moderates who do have well-formed opinions that are just varied in nature or centrist in nature. However, for a lot of people, you'd expect once they take the time to think about things, they'll eventually have a pretty coherent direction to their set of policy preferences. What we see when we examine this empirically, though, is that for the most part, Americans aren't really that ideological in nature, so they don't really have a consistent belief set in most cases. One way of looking at this is, first of all, we mentioned how a few sections ago that if you ask people their opinion one day and then ask the same question a month later, you see a high degree of inconsistency there. So that's one indication that there's not really strong ideological content in the population. Another means of looking at it is to ask a set of questions, for instance, on the economy or dealing with social issues, and see whether there's a coherence there as far as either consistently liberal positions or consistently conservative positions. And again, you don't see a really high frequency of people in the electorate that have this degree of constraint or consistency. A final way of getting at this question of ideology is if you ask someone, what is your opinion on some issue, and then ask them after the fact to explain why do they think that way. If you do that, you don't typically see people invoke ideology in their explanations for why they think a particular way. So if I say, I favor lower taxes, for example, whatever reasoning I give, most people, when you do this, they don't say, like, I'm a conservative, for instance, I'm a fiscal conservative, just because they don't, the ideology that they have doesn't immediately come to mind. So these various empirical patterns that we're talking about combine to sort of form a picture where ideology isn't that widely held one way or the other throughout the electorate. Another approach to this question is asking just, is it really necessary that people have a particular ideology? Maybe we just don't understand where people are coming from when they answer in a manner that doesn't necessarily reflect consistent conservatism or consistent liberalism. Maybe it's just that people draw from a variety of experiences and interests, and this doesn't necessarily produce an array of policy preferences that we can classify as ideological in one direction or the other, but this doesn't necessarily mean that these aren't valid, genuine preferences. Alright, so now we mentioned in this previous discussion about knowledge that at least in terms of the strict empirical evidence, when you ask people questions about the political system and current events, levels of knowledge aren't generally that high. This sort of is in tension with the fact that, as a general statement, our political system throughout history has functioned in an acceptable manner. Obviously, anyone can come up with a variety of failures in our political system at any given point in time that we want to talk about, but just for the most part, our country has survived for getting on to 250 years at this point under the same regime. So, what leads to this? How are we able to overcome low levels of knowledge and nonetheless have a functioning democracy? So one approach to this question is to say, let's not look at specific individuals. So instead of looking at, how does one person change their political views over time, can we see reason in that? Let's shift to a broader picture and look at the aggregate. So how does the overall combination of opinion within the electorate, how does that change as opposed to just one specific person or a series of persons' opinions? So when you look at this and you start charting things at the aggregate level, it seems to be the case that the aggregate time series moves in a pretty reasonable manner. You see it a relatively high degree of stability in aggregate opinion, first of all, compared to a single person's opinion. And when it does move, the change seems to be driven in a logical manner. So you can, I think we put up a chart in one previous lecture where we're looking at presidential approval compared to unemployment, and this moves in a pretty predictable manner. When unemployment goes up, approval goes down for the president. Another recent example, the Iraq War. This starts out as a pretty popular endeavor. As it stretches on, and it's arguably prosecuted poorly, and it obviously starts going worse than we expected it to. Aggregate opinion on the war starts to decrease, and so this is another example of where there is change in opinion over time, but it's done in a manner that we would probably expect and that we can explain. And when we talk about this aggregate versus individual level, it's one thing to say that the aggregate level appears more reasonable than the individual level, but at that point you have to ask yourself, why is this the case? Why do we see reasonable patterns at the aggregate level, but in large measure really unreasonable looking ones among individuals? And one way that this question has been resolved is what's known as the miracle of aggregation. And the fundamental premise here is that if you think of all the people in the population, let's say there's some high proportion of them, maybe 75%, who don't pay much attention to politics, and I'm not saying this from any specific evidence, just throwing it out as an example. Let's say 75% don't pay any attention to politics, and so when they're asked about the war in Iraq or presidential approval, whatever you're talking about, their answer is pretty much going to be just at random. So they don't have any real information to draw on, so they just pick one of the answer choices and say that to the survey interviewer, and that's where their opinion comes from. So when this is the case, you have a random distribution basically of opinions. They pretty much cancel each other out in the net. So you would expect half of the people that are answering randomly to be in favor of any given thing that you're talking about, and then the other half would be opposed to it. And in this case, the net is going to be roughly 0. So who actually ends up driving opinion in a situation like this are those whose opinion is systematically tied to the events that are actually going on in the world. So the remaining 25%, these are going to be the people who do pay attention to politics and current events. So they're going to receive that information that, okay, the war effort is going south, and they're going to in turn adjust their opinion toward the war effort. And so when you have this, you have one group that's net 0 because they're all canceling each other out with random noise, and then another group who is systematically moving as a result of changes of the state of things. The systematic group, they eventually drive the direction of opinion. So they don't have a net 0, so wherever their opinion is moving, that's the direction overall opinion is going to go. Of course, if you think about it mathematically, the magnitude of the change is going to be diminished due to the fact that you have 75% that are canceling each other out, but the remaining 25%, if they're changing in a way that says we're approving less of the war, that's the direction the overall opinion is going to go when you aggregate it all together. And beyond just aggregation, the miracle of aggregation, another way that people can sort of overcome, I guess moving back to the individual level a little bit, one way that people can overcome a general lack of interest in politics and ignorance of the specific things that are going on in the world is through what's known as opinion leaders. And so opinion leaders would be generally elites that, people like politicians themselves can be opinion leaders, public intellectuals, really prominent academics, media figures, people like this who have a really a large public platform to go out and reach a lot of people. And these type of people can give their own opinions, which in turn can influence other people. So in this respect, if you're someone who knows and trusts a particular person in the media, for example, you've gone with followed them for years, and you trust their judgment, you don't necessarily have to become informed yourself. You can just go and watch or listen to this person, and they can tell you how to think. And this is obviously not optimal, but it's just one way that people who are exerting a low level of effort in terms of their participation in political society can nonetheless gain an opinion about what's going on. Another signal that people can use in this, in a similar respect, is their partisanship. So, whereas a lot of people have unstable opinions about any given issue, so their opinion on a war or a policy or whatever, that'll change sometimes from week to week or month to month. Partisanship tends to be a more stable trait. So if you ask someone whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, and they say that they're a Democrat, they're a lot more likely to remain a Democrat later on down the line, however far you go, than just asking them about an individual position. So partisanship tends to be relatively stable in our society. And this is good when we're talking about decision making because presumably you're a Democrat or a Republican for a reason, and so you can trust what the parties are saying to some degree to reflect your interests. So if you don't have to really put any effort into it at all to go and say, all right, who is the Democratic candidate for president? Okay, it's Hillary Clinton. I always vote Democrat. It's worked fine for me in the past, so I'm going to keep voting Democrat. If you're a Republican, Trump has the R next to his name. I'm going to vote R like I always do. Let's vote Trump. And so in this respect, again, this is not an optimal situation. You want people to be informed to the greatest extent that they can. However, assuming your partisanship is correct, like you're not a Democrat who really should be a Republican, or vice versa, this can work for you to a large degree. If you just vote the party line, more often than not, you'll come to the correct answer, basically. So yeah, partisanship. If you ever get into reading about low information decision making in politics and queuing, partisanship is really the most powerful one that's out there. Okay, so we just talked in large part about people not having a ton of information and how does our society and how do people function despite not having a lot of information. There still is, though, a large segment of the population that does have, they do pay attention to politics, they're exposed to the media. Probably the majority of people, even if they're, even among the low-informed people, have some degree of information about politics that they're exposed to. So, despite the overall low level of knowledge in the population, it's still worth looking at how do people, when they receive knowledge or some sort of information, how do they integrate that into an opinion? And so that's what this section is going to be talking about. How do people actually form opinions given their exposure to the political world? And we're going to be talking about two models, and we'll talk about those in a second, both of which fall under the paradigm of what's known as information processing. And this is an approach in psychology, and when it's applied to politics, it's an approach to public opinion that says let's look at the set of information that people receive and see how they integrate that into an eventual opinion. So we'll be interested in like what sort of newspaper articles you're reading, what type of commentary you're hearing on TV, if you have any direct exposure to policies that affect you, things like this that are relevant to the government. We want to see, given what you're receiving as information, what processes are you putting in place to eventually translate that into opinion, like opinions on Obama, opinions on issues, whatever we're talking about. Specifically, we're going to be talking about two different models that are often put up as competitors against one another within the information processing paradigm. And if you find yourself interested in anything that we're talking about in this section, a lot of this topic is dealt with in more detail in the political psychology class that's offered in the department. So if you are interested in the topics here, I'd recommend finding when that's offered and maybe think about enrolling in it. First, though, we're going to talk about the memory-based model of information processing. So, as the name would indicate, as you could probably guess, this is a model that's heavily dependent on what's stored in memory. So this is going to be the primary driver of what your eventual attitudes are. So to begin, when you hear something in the political world, some piece of information, Obama proposed a new education plan, for instance. This piece of information, it may be remembered, it may not be remembered, but if it is remembered, it'll go into your long-term memory. So some proportion of what you encounter will be retained. So what's important about this is that in the memory-based model, when you are then subsequently asked about your political attitudes, so the example that we're going to be used here is, for instance, when you're asked on a survey question, if someone from one of these polling organizations, Gallup, Rasmussen, whoever we're talking about, they call you up and ask about what your opinion on Obama is. The primary thing determining what you report is going to be the set of memories that you recall pertaining to Obama. So, when they call up and ask you the question about his job approval, you'll, think of whatever you can, and given the time restraints, that's relevant to answering the question. So you'll think about what you just heard earlier in the day about the new education program, what he's done in the economy, national security, social issues, foreign affairs. Basically, whatever you can think of that comes to mind, that's what's going to inform your eventual opinion that you tell the pollster. One critical aspect of this theory, though, is that it's not you're not going to recall everything that you've ever heard about Obama when you're asked about him. That would be really not very feasible at all. You'd need way more time than is typically available in a standard political conversation. So it's not really going to be an exhaustive set of considerations that you recall. What's going to drive the subset that you recall is what's salient in your mind. We talked about this quality of salience earlier in the first part of the lecture. So whatever's most important to you at that particular moment, your set of recalled considerations is going to be reflected there. If you're in a situation where, for example, there's a national security alert, a recent terrorist attack, maybe national security issues become more salient to you. So when you're asked about Obama on the survey, you'll start thinking about things, and a lot of them will have to do with national security. This effect is called priming, and priming often has a really important effect on how people answer questions on surveys. Let's walk through now a sort of applied example, a stylized one about the memory-based model and how it goes from things that are stored in memory to eventual evaluations. So let's imagine here's our memory bank, and in this stylized example, this is the entire set of considerations stored in memory pertaining to Obama. So most people's memories are probably going to contain a lot more than 5 considerations regarding Obama, but just for the sake of this example, let's just deal with these 5 because it works just the same. So let's go over them. Maybe you don't like Obamacare, so this is a negatively valenced item for you. You think less of Obama as a result of it. On the other hand, you like that he killed Osama bin Laden, so this is a positive for you. maybe you're concerned with the deficit throughout his term. Maybe you're concerned with relatively lackluster GDP growth throughout most of his term. So these are two other negatives for you. But you're also pleased that he ended the Iraq War and brought most of the troops home from Iraq. So you've got some positive components here in your memory, some negative considerations as well. So let's imagine now that there's maybe a national security event like a terrorist attack or threat here or abroad. So this happens, you hear about it in the news, and for the immediate temporal period following that, for some time, you're primed to think more in terms of national security. Let's now also imagine that this particular evening you get called after you're finished with your dinner. You answer the phone and it's a pollster who wants to ask you about all your different political opinions of the day. Maybe you agree. A lot of people don't, as it turns out, in the current era of polling. But maybe you're a nice person who wants to give your opinion, so you agree to answer the questions. And it eventually comes up that they want to know how you think Obama is handling his job as president. So when this occurs, again, you have these 5 different things stored in memory. You're not going to recall all of them, though. Again, we said that's generally not feasible because we just have too many considerations. Maybe in this stylized example you could, but let's just imagine you can't. What you do recall is what you're most primed to think about. So the national security issues. So killing Osama bin Laden has something to do with national security. The Iraq War as well. So these are the 2 items that you bring to mind, and these are the 2 things you consider when you eventually report your evaluation to the pollster. You take into account what you've thought of. You say, all right, these are both positive items, so you report a positive evaluation. You say that Obama is handling his job as president well. The interesting thing to note here, of course, is that although the overall balance of memories and stored in long-term memory is negative, there's one more negative than positive. The prime leads you to think about only a specific subset of them, which affects what your ultimate evaluation is. You could imagine if there is an economic prime, for example, you might just think of the high deficit and low GDP growth, and you'd recall 2 negative considerations instead of 2 positive ones, which would lead you to report a negative evaluation. And this illustrates the ultimate effect of priming. So the other model we're going to talk about is the online model. And the way this works is not through recalled memories, but instead this model is saying that as you encounter information in the political world, it's being evaluated in real time and integrated into a running tally, basically, a running tally of your evaluation. So what this looks like is basically when you encounter a piece of negative information about Obama, as soon as that happens, that's affecting an overall standing evaluation that you have of Obama, and it's being ticked downward in the negative direction. So then when you hear the piece about he proposed this new education program that you like, say that's positive, that's influencing your tally in a positive direction. So you've got a persistent running evaluation of Obama that's being affected immediately by whatever you're encountering in the political world, and the ultimate quality of the evaluation is going to be based on the balance of positive versus negative considerations. So if you've encountered 10 negative versus 5 positive pieces of information about Obama over the course of however long we're talking about that they remain relevant, this is going to result in a net negative tally. The key here being, though, that you don't necessarily have to even remember what eventually went into it. If your tally is composed of these 15 items, you would still know ultimately at the end, just by remembering the balance, that you have a negative evaluation. You have a net negative 5, although maybe not know the specific number. You know that it's negative in direction, but you don't have to remember these specific 10 pieces or these specific 5 pieces because you have this running count, basically. There's all you have to recall is the actual ultimate end count. What's going on beforehand to lead to it, that's not important. The ultimate evaluation that you report is just from the tally. This is maybe a bit less intuitive than the memory-based model, so it would, the example we have here is going to hopefully help a little bit. So we're going to be dealing with the same set of information we had from the previous example, but now let's imagine we're encountering it in a serial manner. So to begin with, let's say the first piece of information we encounter is something pertaining to Obamacare that we don't like, and this is negative in our view. Again, this is the same as the last time. So our tally starts out at -1. So we keep going through our day. We encounter another piece of information. He kills Osama bin Laden. This is a positive, and so this affects our tally again. However, in this time it's going up 1. So this brings the net of the tally from -1 back to balance, 0. The next piece of information we encounter, let's say it's about the Iraq War, another positive for us, so another positive mark in the tally. So we're up to a +1 now. Then, however, let's say we start encountering some information about the economy, the deficit we don't like, which brings the tally back down to 1, and then we're reminded of somewhat slow GDP growth and throughout a lot of other parts of this term. So this is bringing the tally back down to -1. So ultimately, we go through this process iteratively and sequentially, but the final tally reflects all these different pieces of information. It ends up a -1. So now you put yourself back in the shoes of you're asked to answer some survey questions. You could imagine by this point, maybe you've forgotten everything that happened up here. Maybe you don't remember what the specific whatever you read in the newspaper, heard on the radio that day. But what you do remember is this: the ultimate tally. You remember that it's net negative, given what went into it, which again we've forgotten. So when you're asked, how do you think Obama's handling his job, all you have to do is think back to this -1, and you report a negative evaluation. And so, in some respect, this is a bit more normatively pleasing than the online model, in that really the ultimate evaluation is reflecting the full set of information you've been exposed to. You recall back to the example we had of the online model, or excuse me, the memory-based model. You reported, based on priming, a positive evaluation, whereas the overall set of information had one more negative item. With the online model, though, that's not really a possibility, just because all of the information is being integrated as you go. It can be discarded afterward, but you still retain the tally. And this is, in terms of another normative implication of this, this is another way that we can say, all right, despite low levels of political knowledge, how do people nonetheless manage to function in the political system? So this would say that maybe people at one point did have certain political knowledge, and that gets integrated into the tally, but maybe at some point they forget it. And so when they're asked a political knowledge question, maybe they get the answer wrong, but that's not to say they never had that knowledge. And if they did at one point have that knowledge and just forgot it, it's still entirely possible that it's been integrated into their final evaluation for whatever it was relevant to. All right, and so those were just some basic examples of these different types of information processing models. Again, this is a specialty, this subject matter, political psychology of our political science department, so if you are interested in what we're talking about here, there's probably more for you somewhere in the department. But anyway, that concludes the lecture on public opinion. Our next one will be the final one on elections, campaigns, and voting, and I'll see you then.